Imagine this. You're at a university lecture hall, the walls buzzing not with curiosity, but with tension. A student stands up, trembling slightly. As someone with chronic anxiety, a marginalized background, and a history of trauma, I need to express how this reading list is exclusionary. The room quiets. The professor, uncertain, nods. The crowd does not question the argument's logic. It surrenders to the weight of the speaker's suffering. The student's identity, not their reasoning, carries the day. This moment is not fiction. It is emblematic of a deeper cultural phenomenon. Victimhood as power. There was a time when strength, perseverance, and agency were signs of social capital. The battle-scarred were respected, yes, but it was because they transcended the pain, not because they wore it as a badge. Today, something has shifted. The moral high ground no longer belongs to the resilient hero but to the one most visibly wronged. In public discourse, the authority of suffering has eclipsed the authority of wisdom. To suffer is no longer simply to endure misfortune. It has become a form of credential. How did this happen? How did the narrative of being a victim turn into a form of virtue signaling? Friedrich Nietzsche warned of this reversal over a century ago. On the genealogy of morality, he spoke of the slave morality, a worldview birthed not from strength but from resentment. According to Nietzsche, those who lacked power redefined good and evil to suit their station. Strength became oppressive. Weakness became virtuous. What began as psychological compensation has, in modern times, become cultural currency. This morality has now evolved, or perhaps devolved, into a marketplace of grievances. Suffering confers status. The deeper your wound, the more authentic your voice. This isn't to deny the reality of trauma, oppression, or marginalization. These are facts. What's disturbing is the incentive structure. A society that increasingly rewards victimhood risks incentivizing identification with injury. There is a quiet tyranny here. Those who do not claim trauma may feel silenced, or even complicit. The pressure to locate oneself within an oppressed category becomes immense. If you are not marginalized, you are expected to apologize. What began as compassion has metastasized into competition. An unspoken hierarchy of pain emerges. Who is more hurt, more disadvantaged, more silenced? This is not healing. It is performative suffering, weaponized to win arguments, gain attention, or seize moral authority. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst, once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." In the cult of victimhood, suffering becomes a mask, one that hides, ironically, from real introspection. We are encouraged not to transcend our pain, but to broadcast it, to build our identities around it. Pain becomes not something to understand, but something to wield. But what is the psychological cost of this inversion? When the self becomes synonymous with its wound, where is the space for growth? Viktor Frankl, Holocaust survivor and author of Man's Search for Meaning, wrote, "Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." What happens when that space collapses, when our response is reduced to reflexive outrage, our growth outsourced to validation from others? We risk becoming trapped in our wounds, unable to move forward because our identities have fused with our pain. There is also a chilling social cost. In a world where being wronged becomes synonymous with being right, dialogue becomes impossible. Disagreement is framed as harm. Critique is violence. Those who question the logic of victimhood are labeled as oppressors. It is a culture that eats its own tail, unable to distinguish genuine compassion from compulsive validation. And so we arrive at the paradox. A society obsessed with trauma but allergic to healing. A generation fluent in the language of oppression but mute in the dialect of resilience. But the question remains, how did we get here? What psychological, cultural, and philosophical currents converged to make victimhood a status symbol? To answer this, we must go back further, to the roots of identity, the shifting sands of modernity, and the psychological hunger that hides behind every grievance. Let us turn now to the psychological scaffolding that made this phenomenon possible. The modern psyche is a fractured mirror, each shard reflecting a desire to be seen, understood, and affirmed. But in a world saturated with noise, where meaning feels increasingly elusive and institutions offer little guidance, pain has emerged as the most recognizable form of selfhood. Why? Because pain demands attention. It signals urgency. It bypasses debate. It says, "Look at me. I hurt. Therefore, I exist." To understand how victimhood became a form of psychological currency, we must trace the evolution of the self. In earlier epochs, identity was rooted in external structures. Family, nation, religion, tradition. These were binding forces that gave individuals a framework to locate themselves within a larger narrative. But with the decline of these institutions, what sociologist Zygmunt Bauman called the shift from solid to liquid modernity, individuals were left adrift, narratively naked, tasked with constructing their identities from scratch. Enter trauma. In a world where belief systems collapse and the social script dissolves, trauma becomes one of the few shared currencies left. It unites, it authenticates, and crucially, it simplifies. You don't need to argue for your dignity if you've suffered. It's assumed. Jean-Paul Sartre, in his existential writings, emphasized that existence precedes essence, that we are what we make of ourselves. But in the age of curated pain, that freedom has become terrifying. To be responsible for meaning-making is a lonely burden. How much easier it is to anchor oneself to pain, to say, "This happened to me, this is who I am." Victimhood becomes essence. There's a twisted psychological logic to it. Pain, unlike happiness, is unimpeachable. No one dares to question another's suffering without being seen as cruel. So, pain becomes a fortress, a safe house in a world where the self is constantly under siege. But the safety is illusory, for to live inside pain is to become enslaved to it. Arthur Schopenhauer warned, "A man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills." When pain becomes the primary lens through which we interpret ourselves, we lose the will to transcend it. This is where the dark alchemy begins. The wounded self starts to monetize its pain, not just financially, but socially and spiritually. We see this in microcosms across social media, where personal tragedies are performed as content, and where likes, shares, and comments form a digital altar to suffering. One's trauma becomes a brand. Victimhood becomes influence. The marketplace of attention rewards those who can narrate their wounds most compellingly. But something deeper is happening beneath this performance. A kind of psychic inflation, what Jung would call a possession by the complex. The ego becomes so entangled with the story of the wound that the person forgets they are more than it. Jung noted that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. Today, we might say the greatest burden is the unlived self, the self too occupied being wounded to become whole. We must also speak of projection. In the psychology of victimhood, the world becomes a mirror for internal pain. Injustice is seen everywhere, not because it isn't real, but because it confirms the narrative of personal harm. People begin to seek out oppression not for its eradication, but for its ability to validate their identity. This leads to an endless scanning for microaggressions, slights, and symbolic violence, not for the purpose of healing, but for confirmation. Yet this pursuit is doomed, because no amount of external recognition can fill the existential void that arises when we locate our entire self in pain. Aldous Huxley once said, "Experience is not what happens to a man. It is what a man does with what happens to him." But our culture has flipped that wisdom. Now, experience is elevated because it happened, not because it was transformed. And so, we create a society where people are not rewarded for what they overcome, but for what they endure. Where growth is seen as betrayal and recovery as denial. Where clinging to your wound is more profitable than healing from it. This is the psychological scaffolding, fragile, alluring, and deeply corrosive. And it does not exist in a vacuum. It feeds off something larger. A culture of validation that turns personal experience into moral authority and wounds into weapons. To understand that next layer, we must look not within the psyche but outward, toward the cultural machinery that sustains this economy of pain and enshrines victimhood in the public square. Imagine walking into a cathedral, not one built of stone and stained glass, but of narratives, hashtags, and televised confessions. At its altar stands not a saint nor a sage, but the one who has suffered most publicly. Their pain is canonized, their trauma ritualized. The crowd listens in reverent silence, not to be transformed, but to affirm. This is the new cultural temple, the sanctuary of victimhood worship. How did our culture become a cathedral of the wounded? The shift was not sudden, but slow, subtle, and psychologically seductive. As the secular age advanced, the void once filled by religion, myth, and ritual began to ache. Modernity brought unprecedented freedom but stripped away the structures that once gave suffering meaning. Into this void stepped the culture industry, media, academia, entertainment, recasting suffering as the new sacrament. Where religion once taught the redemptive power of pain, culture now offers its performative power. But there is no transcendence, only attention. No resurrection, only repetition. In a world addicted to visibility, pain is no longer what is endured in silence. It is content. It is leverage. It is the narrative currency of those who have learned the cultural equation. To suffer is to matter. This is most clearly seen in media ecosystems, where personal stories of trauma are mined and broadcast not for healing, but for spectacle. Daytime talk shows, trauma memoirs, viral threads. Each story invites the audience into a voyeuristic ritual of collective affirmation. But what masquerades as empathy often functions as indulgence. The pain becomes entertainment, and the audience gets their hit of catharsis without any real ethical engagement. This theatricalization of suffering has been especially potent in the realm of identity politics. What began as noble movements for justice have, in some corners, devolved into competitive victimhood, a zero-sum game of oppression Olympics. The result? A new form of cultural capital. In an era where authenticity is prized, lived experience becomes unchallengeable. Trumps reason, evidence, even moral complexity. This is the tyranny of the I feel, where argument is displaced by effect and critique is treated as invalidation. As Jean Baudrillard warned, we now live in a world of simulations, representations that replace reality itself. Pain, once raw and personal, is digitized, aestheticized, and consumed in fragments. The wound is no longer private. It is public property. Even the institutions that once upheld objectivity, universities, journalism, the arts, have begun to genuflect before this new order. Professors navigate syllabi with trigger warnings, terrified of offending. Journalists elevate anecdotes above data. Artists fear being labeled insensitive more than irrelevant. In this culture, power flows to the most aggrieved, and dissent is rebranded as violence. But culture does not merely reflect values. It reinforces and reproduces them. The more we elevate victimhood, the more we incentivize it. Young people, searching for meaning in a fragmented world, are taught that their pain is their identity, that to grow beyond it is to betray it, that to move forward is to abandon their tribe. Arthur Schopenhauer's bleak insight echoes here. Compassion is the basis of morality, he wrote, but in our cultural moment, compassion has been weaponized, not to uplift, but to conscript. Those who do not conform to the new dogmas are shamed, silenced, or exiled from the moral community. And so, we are left with a paradoxical culture, one that fetishizes pain but fears truth, that amplifies grievance but punishes redemption. In this cathedral, the sermon is always the same. Suffering confers virtue, and healing is suspect. But what happens when everyone is a victim and no one is allowed to heal? What happens when the pursuit of recognition eclipses the pursuit of resilience? We begin to lose something vital, not just as individuals, but as a civilization. We lose the tragic dignity of the human condition, the ability to suffer without spectacle, to endure without applause, to transcend without permission. Yet even now, beneath the surface of cultural spectacle, some still yearn for meaning beyond victimhood. The question is no longer whether pain is real, it is. The question is, must it define us? Or can we reclaim the power to choose what our suffering becomes? To answer that, we must examine the deeper existential hunger driving this phenomenon. A need for identity, belonging, and significance in a world that no longer offers it freely. A young man stares at his reflection, scrolling through his feed as the faces of others flash by. Anguished stories, confessions of injustice, declarations of pain. He doesn't know who he is, but he knows one thing clearly. He has not suffered enough to be heard. In a world that once asked, "What do you believe?" we now ask, "What have you endured?" Identity has shifted from being a question of essence to a ledger of wounds. We are not who we become, we are what has been done to us. At the heart of this cultural shift lies a profound and increasingly urgent crisis of meaning. In the wake of the Enlightenment, traditional sources of purpose, faith, duty, community, lineage have eroded. In their place has arisen the atomized self, forced to fabricate meaning in an age where every grand narrative has been deconstructed, every moral certainty cast into doubt. Viktor Frankl, whose psychological philosophy was forged in the hell of the Holocaust, understood this existential vacuum better than anyone. When a person can't find a deep sense of meaning, he wrote, they distract themselves with pleasure, but pleasure is fleeting. When it fails, what remains is pain. And pain, unlike pleasure, feels real, cuts deep. It anchors, but anchoring oneself in pain alone does not create meaning. It merely avoids the abyss. Frankl argued that even in the face of immense suffering, human beings can discover profound purpose, but only if they choose to relate to their suffering freely, not reactively. This distinction is critical. When pain becomes involuntary identity, it paralyzes. When it is integrated into a larger journey, it empowers. The cultural moment we inhabit does not encourage integration. It encourages attachment. Pain becomes not a teacher, but a flag. Victimhood becomes not a passage, but a permanent address. And behind this trend lies a deeper fear, that without our pain, we might be nothing at all. Jean-Paul Sartre famously said, "Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself." But what happens when the self has no tools to make itself? When all that is offered are templates of trauma, scripts of inherited grievance, and no vision of becoming? For many, adopting a victim identity offers the illusion of belonging. In an era of social disintegration, the communities that form around shared wounds are some of the only places people feel seen. Online tribes based on race, gender, neurodivergence, or trauma histories offer not just support, but moral superiority. Those inside the circle are the enlightened. Those outside are suspect. This is not connection, it is tribalism masquerading as healing. And like all tribes, it requires enemies. Anyone who threatens the sanctity of the shared grievance, any voice suggesting agency, growth, or complexity, is cast as a traitor. The goal is not reconciliation, but perpetuation. The community survives by never resolving the pain. Aldous Huxley warned of this long ago. Most human beings have an almost infinite capacity for taking things for granted. In our case, we've taken victimhood for granted as the default position of authenticity. We assume that if someone speaks from pain, they must be right, not just about their experience, but about the world. This has devastating consequences for intellectual life. Inquiry becomes impossible. Criticism becomes heresy. Disagreement becomes trauma. The marketplace of ideas is flooded not with arguments, but with stories. Not with thought, but with sentiment. But meaning is not born from feeling alone. It emerges when feelings are metabolized, when the raw materials of pain are transmuted through reflection, action, and responsibility. That is the alchemy of the human spirit, and it is precisely what we are losing. Jean-Paul Sartre famously said, "Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself." But what happens when the self has no tools to make itself? Unresolved suffering. We have confused the signal of pain with the substance of identity. We are asking our wounds to tell us who we are. But wounds are not meant to speak. They are meant to heal. This is not a call to suppress pain. Quite the opposite. It is a plea to give pain a nobler function. To see it not as a brand or shield, but as a starting point. A real identity is not what has happened to you. It is what you choose to become in the face of it. To move toward that, however, we must confront the systems, ideological, educational, digital, that reinforce pain as virtue. we must look at how power has shifted not just psychologically or culturally, but politically, and how those in control have learned to manipulate victimhood itself. Picture a debate stage. One speaker presents a data-driven argument, quoting studies, citing history, appealing to reason. The other responds, "As a survivor of systemic oppression, your statistics don't speak to my experience." The audience erupts in applause, not for the coherence of the rebuttal, but for the moral authority it represents. In our political age, reasoned discourse has been increasingly replaced by emotional leverage. And nowhere is this more evident than in the rise of victimhood as a form of power. This shift is not accidental, it is structural, ideological, and strategic. In a society that once prized merit, character, and logic, the tide has turned. Now, moral capital flows to the aggrieved. If you can claim oppression, you can claim authority. This inversion of power, a Nietzschean revenge of the last man, is not simply a cultural mood. It is a political tool. Nietzsche foresaw the danger of ressentiment politics, the rechanneling of weakness into moral superiority. In The Genealogy of Morals, he wrote that when the weak cannot overcome their oppressors, they redefine the game. They call the strong evil and the weak good, thereby asserting dominance not through action, but through moral indictment. That is precisely the mechanism at work in much of today's political rhetoric. Oppression is not merely a problem to be solved, it is a status to be weaponized. To be a victim is to be unimpeachable. Any challenge to your narrative becomes an act of violence. Any opposition becomes oppression. This has profound consequences. In political debates, identity now trumps argument. Lived experience is treated as inherently more truthful than critical inquiry. Those who question narratives of suffering, even compassionately, are dismissed or canceled. The marketplace of ideas becomes a courtroom, and the verdict always favors the most wounded. Jean-François Lyotard described postmodernism as incredulity toward meta-narratives. That incredulity has not led to skepticism and reason, it has led to a vacuum filled by subjective experience, especially those coded in trauma. When truth is reduced to perspective, power becomes a matter of who can evoke the most pain, not who can offer the most insight. We see this in public policy as well. Legislation is increasingly informed by the language of harm reduction, not in the medical sense but in the emotional one. Concepts like safe spaces, trigger warnings, and emotional labor now shape the political lexicon. While originally intended to protect the vulnerable, these terms have been co-opted to shield ideology from challenge. Even educational institutions, once the bastions of critical thought, have become ideological battlegrounds. Students are taught that discomfort is a form of violence. Professors censor themselves. Dissent becomes a liability. The classroom, once a crucible for intellectual rigor, is transformed into a therapeutic echo chamber. And yet, amid all this, the state watches. Not passively. Politicians have learned to exploit victimhood for their own ends, crafting campaigns around identity, selling outrage, and promising salvation not through policy, but through perpetual grievance. They present themselves as protectors of the aggrieved, but their power depends on keeping the wound open. This is the politics of paralysis. If the individual is always wounded, then the individual is always dependent on the system, the party, the ideology. Healing is not encouraged, because a healed populace is an empowered one. Better to keep them divided, fragile, and grateful for representation. Arthur Miller once wrote, "An era can be said to end when its basic illusions are exhausted." We are nearing that point. The illusion that moral authority flows only from suffering, that identity must be rooted in trauma, that politics should be built on the scaffolding of pain. These are beginning to show their cracks. But the question remains, if we relinquish victimhood as the axis of identity and power, what replaces it? What philosophy can meet the moment without denying suffering, yet refusing to deify it? We must return to the concept that suffering is not the final word, but the starting point. That agency, not grievance, must drive transformation. And that individuals are not political pawns, but meaning-seeking beings capable of rising above their pain. To explore this path, we must end where all great philosophical inquiries begin, not with ideology or identity, but with the soul's confrontation with itself. Imagine a person standing at a crossroads, holding a mirror shattered into countless pieces, each shard reflecting a different injury, a different injustice, a different mask. Behind them lies a well-worn path paved with recognition, validation, and applause for wounds displayed. Ahead lies an uncertain trail, quiet and unadorned, marked by solitude, struggle, and the terrifying possibility of real change. Which road leads to liberation? We live in a time when wounds have become identity, and identity has become destiny. But what if we have confused recognition with redemption? What if, in elevating pain to the pinnacle of selfhood, we've forgotten what it means to be whole? The sovereign self is not the self that has never suffered. It is the self that refuses to be defined by suffering. Carl Jung knew this intimately. He wrote, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." But this act of becoming is not a passive drift. It is a courageous rebellion against the gravitational pull of victimhood. It is the painful, sacred work of integration, not fixation. Integration means facing the trauma, naming it, learning from it, but not worshiping it. The wound is acknowledged, but it is not enthroned. The story is honored, but it is not repeated like a script. In Jungian terms, it is the path of individuation, the becoming of a complete and conscious self. This journey is antithetical to the current cultural climate, where people are encouraged to curate their pain and outsource their meaning. But no one can walk the inward road for you. No institution, no algorithm, no ideology can rescue the self from the soul's responsibility to itself. Viktor Frankl believed that meaning is not given. It is chosen, wrestled from the chaos of life like gold from the earth. Even in Auschwitz, he saw that those who survived spiritually were those who saw themselves as more than their pain. "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing," he wrote, "the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. That is the essential truth our culture has forgotten. Freedom is internal first. No matter how valid our pain, it cannot be our final narrative. To dwell endlessly in victimhood is to mistake the prison for the home. This does not mean we dismiss injustice. On the contrary, true justice requires individuals who have transcended their own wounds and can now act from clarity, not compulsion. A society of healed individuals is far more dangerous to corrupt systems than a society endlessly fighting over whose pain is greatest. The greatest revolution is not declaring your pain. It is declaring your sovereignty. This revolution begins when we recognize that meaning lies beyond grievance, that we must teach young people not just how to identify harm, but how to transform it, that growth is not betrayal, but the point. As Nietzsche wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "One must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. The chaos is inevitable. The star is a choice. Transcendence is not denial. It is a radical confrontation with reality, a refusal to remain a passive actor in someone else's script. It is choosing not to perform pain for applause, but to live with purpose in spite of pain's presence. To reclaim the sovereign self is to remember that we are not merely products of history, race, trauma, or fate. We are not reducible to the worst thing that happened to us. We are meaning makers, not meaning seekers, and the meaning we choose is the life we live. In this world, where victimhood is offered as virtue, the real rebellion is healing. The real revolution is agency. The real identity is not the wound, but the warrior who walked through it and did not stay. Let us leave behind the culture that kneels before suffering and refuses to rise. Let us build one that honors pain, but does not obey it. That listens to trauma, but refuses to make it king. That sees each soul as more than its shadow, capable of turning even the deepest injury into something radiant, something free. Because the future does not belong to the most wounded. It belongs to those who choose to become whole.